The day Nora Calloway came home, she found a park on her land. Not a misunderstanding. Not a mistake. A paved path, park benches, a landscaped garden, and a sign that read a gift to our neighbors from the Lakeview Estates HOA. Built on her property. While her father was dying. While nobody answered his letter. Sandra Vance, HOA President, smiled across the table and slid a form toward her. Sign here. Give it up. Walk away. Nora looked at the form. Looked at Sandra. Set it down unsigned. Because Sandra didn't know what Nora did for a living. And she was about to find out. The land remembers. The drive into Hargrove County felt different this time. Nora Calloway had made the same trip down Route 9 100 times in her life, windows down, radio up, the smell of pine and red clay coming through the vents, but she had never made it as an orphan before. She was 36 years old, driving to claim the house where she had grown up, and both of her parents were in the ground, and the August heat pressing through the windshield felt less like summer and more like a verdict. She turned off the highway at the hand-painted sign that still read Lakeview Estates, though the lake it referenced was technically a reservoir, and the estates were modest 2- and 3-bedroom houses arranged around 3 quiet streets and a shared green space. Her father, James Calloway, had bought the corner lot on Birchwood Lane in 1987, long before the neighborhood had an HOA, long before it had anything except decent people who waved from their driveways and left tomatoes on each other's porches. He had built the house with 2 cousins and a borrowed concrete mixer. He had planted the oak tree in the front yard the week Nora was born. He had lived there for 37 years, maintained the property with meticulous care, paid every tax and every bill on time, and died of a stroke on a Tuesday morning in February without ever once causing a problem for anyone. Nora had not been there when he died. That was the part she carried like a stone in her chest. She had been in Denver. She had been in the middle of a 6-month consulting engagement with the Army Corps of Engineers, reviewing flood control infrastructure across 3 river basins in Colorado, because that was the kind of work that took a hydrological engineer away from home for long stretches. She had always told herself her father understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Now she would never know which. She had come back for the funeral, sorted through the paperwork, met with the estate attorney, made the necessary arrangements. Then she had returned to Denver to finish the contract, because she had professional obligations and because grief felt more manageable from a distance, which she recognized, even at the time, as a cowardly reason. Now the contract was done. The house was hers. She was driving back to Lakeview Estates with a carload of boxes and 17 months of accumulated guilt riding in the passenger seat. She turned onto Birchwood Lane, and the first thing she saw was that the old wooden fence along the rear of her father's property was gone. She slowed the car. The fence had been there since at least the mid-90s. White painted, 6 feet high, running the full length of the rear property line before curving to mark the eastern boundary where the lot met a natural drainage corridor, a shallow seasonal creek that ran between her father's land and the open space adjacent to the newer development next door. James Calloway had maintained that fence the way he maintained everything, without drama, with care. Now a cedar fence stood in its place, stained dark brown, set back approximately 12 feet inside what Nora was fairly certain was her property line. And beyond that fence, in the space between where the old line had been and where the new one stood, she could see a paved walking path. A park bench. A landscaped planting bed. A small sign mounted on a post. Nora parked the car. She sat for a moment. She was a person who had spent her professional life reading topographical surveys and drainage maps, who understood better than most that landscape never lies, that the physical world keeps its records in elevation changes and soil compaction and the memory of where water has run. She looked at what she could see through the cedar slats, and she performed a quiet mental calculation, and the calculation told her that a portion of her property had been converted, without her knowledge and without her consent, into what appeared to be a community park amenity. She got out. She walked to the rear of the property and found a gap wide enough to read the sign. Lakeview Estates Community Nature Preserve. Established May 2023. A gift to our neighbors from the Lakeview Estates HOA Board of Directors. She checked the date on her phone. August 2024. The fence had gone up, the path had been paved, the benches had been installed, and the sign had been planted 15 months ago. While her father was sick. While he was dying. While she was in Denver finishing a contract and managing grief from a safe distance. She stood in the heat and looked at the nature preserve on her land and felt the particular cold clarity that comes when a situation is so wrong it resolves, paradoxically, into something almost simple. Not rage. The feeling she got when she looked at a floodplain map and found a drainage calculation that someone had gotten badly, consequentially wrong. The professional need to fix it. She went inside. The house smelled of him still, old wood, coffee, the particular dusty warmth of a closed-up summer house. She sat at her father's kitchen table, put her hands flat on the surface, and let herself miss him for exactly 2 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and began to work. The HOA office for Lakeview Estates operated out of a converted garage near the development's entrance, beige vinyl siding, glass doors that reflected the parking lot. Nora arrived at 9 the next morning, having spent the previous evening reviewing the county's property records, the original 1984 subdivision plat, and every document in the manila folder the estate attorney had given her. She carried her mother's leather portfolio, a civil engineer who had used it for 20 years of client meetings, and inside it, a printed county parcel map, a certified copy of the deed to 14 Birchwood Lane, and 7 pages of handwritten notes organized under numbered headings. She had also pulled the HOA's corporate registration from the Secretary of State's office. Current. She had pulled the recorded CC&Rs, all 41 pages, and read them. Nothing in them authorized the HOA to alter, develop, or appropriate private property belonging to individual lot owners. The front desk woman told her to take a seat. The HOA president would be with her shortly. Sandra Vance was not shortly. She was 22 minutes, which Nora used to verify, on her phone, the exact coordinates of the property line as recorded with the county surveyor. When Sandra arrived, she arrived as a complete presentation. Mid-50s, platinum blonde hair that required significant professional assistance, white linen blazer over navy slacks, an aluminum clipboard with her name embossed on the back. In the parking lot Nora had noted a white Lexus with a personalized plate that read Lvoa 1. Sandra moved with the deliberate authority of someone who has not had a conversation go badly in a long time, and she sat down across from Nora and placed the clipboard on the table between them like a territorial marker and smiled. "Miss Calloway." Her voice was warm and practiced. "First of all, I want to say how sorry we all are for your loss. Your father was a lovely part of this community." "Thank you," Nora said. "I understand you've recently taken ownership of the Birchwood Lane property. If you have questions about how things work here, I'm always happy to walk new homeowners through our community standards." "I grew up in that house," Nora said. "I'm familiar with the community." A brief recalibration behind Sandra's eyes. "Of course. What can I do for you today?" Nora placed the parcel map on the table, oriented so Sandra could read it, then set the deed copy beside it. She touched the boundary line with her fingertip. "I'd like to discuss the structure built on my property in May of last year." Sandra looked at the map, then at Nora, choosing the person rather than the document. "I think there may be some confusion about the property boundaries in that area. It's a common issue with older lots along the drainage corridor. The nature preserve was developed entirely on HOA common land. The county parcel map disagrees. The boundary line runs here." Nora indicated the recorded line. "Your cedar fence runs here." She indicated the parallel line, 12 feet inside the first. "The distance between those lines matches the footprint of the paved path and the seating area I observed yesterday." Sandra's smile became more sculptural, more effortful. "Those old plat maps can have significant margin of error. I'd be happy to have our landscaping consultant take a look. I'd prefer a licensed surveyor. County certified. I'll cover the cost." Nora placed a single sheet on the table. "I'd also like to review the board meeting minutes from when the Nature Preserve project was approved. Under your CC&Rs, Section 9, Article 3, homeowners are entitled to inspect board records within 14 days of a written request." "That's my written request." Sandra looked at the sheet. She looked at Nora. She was doing what people do when they have been the most prepared person in every room for a long time and are encountering, for the first time in some while, someone who is equally or more prepared. "Miss Calloway," she said, recalibrating into a softer register, "I understand you may be feeling protective of your father's property, and that's completely natural. But the nature preserve has been a wonderful amenity for this entire community. Property values in Lakeview Estates have increased significantly since we developed the green corridor. That benefits you as a homeowner." "I don't dispute that a well-maintained green space increases property values," Nora said. "I dispute that you built it on my land without my knowledge or consent, and without any legal authority to do so." She closed the portfolio. "I'd also like to know whether the HOA carried liability insurance on the nature preserve, and whether that insurer has been informed the underlying property may not belong to the HOA." Sandra stood. The smile was gone. "I'll have our HOA attorney reach out to you." "That's fine," Nora said, already gathering her documents. "I look forward to hearing from them." The HOA attorney, Graydon Pruitt, called 4 days later. He was professionally civil in the way of real estate attorneys assessing how much of a problem they are dealing with before deciding how aggressive to be. "Miss Calloway, I've reviewed the situation and want to be upfront. There's a boundary question here I think a straightforward conversation can resolve. I've already requested a survey, Nora said. Licensed, county certified. She's scheduled for next Thursday. A brief pause. I see. In the meantime, I did want to make the board's position clear. Even assuming some overlap with your property line, the HOA may have a valid adverse possession claim under North Carolina statute. The nature preserve has been maintained continuously and openly for more than 15 months. Adverse possession in North Carolina requires 10 years of continuous, hostile, open, and exclusive possession. 15 months doesn't approach that threshold. Nora let that settle before continuing. Additionally, my father filed a written objection to the fence installation with your board in June of last year, approximately 1 month after construction began. I have a copy of that letter, with the certified mail receipt attached. His documented objection interrupts any adverse possession timeline. A longer pause. You said your father filed. In writing. Certified mail. Return receipt requested. Signed by your HOA office on June 14 of last year. She had found the letter in the accordion file in her father's home office, tucked behind the property tax records. No response from the board. No resolution. A deliberate decision to ignore an elderly man's written objection about the occupation of his land. The board records should reflect his correspondence. I'll be reviewing those when they're provided. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. I think it would be productive to schedule a meeting with the full board to discuss possible remedies. I'll be available after the survey results are in, Nora said. Please have the board records ready at that time. The 14-day window expires Monday. She hung up. The survey confirmed what the parcel map had indicated. 13.5 feet of the nature preserve's eastern edge, including the paved walkway, 2 park benches, a planting bed, and the HOA's commemorative sign, sat on Nora Calloway's property. The surveyor, Rita Jansen, had been doing this work in Hargrove County for 30 years. She handed Nora the certified plat and said, simply, whoever built that fence knew or should have known where the line was. That sentence stayed with Nora as she drove home. The board meeting minutes arrived on the last day of the 14-day window, delivered in a manila envelope left with the front desk woman rather than handed over directly. Nora read them twice. They were interesting. The minutes showed the Nature Preserve project had been approved by the board in March 2023, presented by Sandra Vance as a community enhancement initiative to be built on the undeveloped drainage corridor adjacent to HOA common areas. No survey had been commissioned before construction. No investigation of the property boundary. No mention of the Calloway parcel at all. There was, however, a reference to the project contractor, Vance Property Solutions, LLC. Nora looked up Vance Property Solutions in the Secretary of State's corporate registry. Registered 2019. Listed officer and registered agent, Sandra M. Vance. Co-owner per the operating agreement on file, Douglas R. Vance, her husband. Sandra Vance had approved a contract with her own company to build a park on someone else's land and had billed the HOA, meaning the community's dues-funded reserves, $94,000 for the work. She pulled 4 years of HOA financial records through a formal homeowner request. The reserve fund had declined from $247,000 in 2020 to $61,000 in 2024. The decline tracked almost exactly with the increase in Vance Property Solutions contracts. 12 contracts total, across 4 fiscal years, totaling $312,000. In not one instance did the meeting minutes reflect a competitive bidding process or a conflict of interest disclosure, both required under the CC&Rs. She sat with all of it for a while, thinking about the different directions she could take this. Then she called Marcus Delaney. Marcus had been 2 years ahead of her at NC State's civil engineering program. They had stayed close because they were both people who found genuine pleasure in talking about floodplain management on a Saturday afternoon. He was now a supervising engineer at the State Dam Safety Program, reviewing the structural adequacy of water impoundment structures across North Carolina, and he owed her several favors from the last time the Army Corps had seconded her to a state project he was running. I need you to look at something, she said. Nora. Welcome home. He sounded genuinely glad. I heard you were back. There's a drainage corridor on my property. Seasonal Creek runs off the ridgeline into the lower basin. The HOA next door built a paved path across the floodway. Without a FEMA floodplain development permit, as far as I can determine. A pause. Across the floodway. I checked FEMA's portal and the county planning department's records both. No permit on file for the Birchwood Lane drainage corridor. The sound Marcus made was part professional concern, part the particular satisfaction of an engineer encountering a problem that has a definite and documentable answer. Send me everything. And Nora, is there any upstream impoundment on that creek? The Hendersons used to have a farm pond up on the ridge, she said. About 40 acres. I don't know who owns it now. I'll find out, he said. He found out in 2 days. The farm pond on the ridgeline above Lakeview Estates had been purchased in 2018 by a land investment trust and leased to a conservation organization that maintained it as wildlife habitat. It was, officially, a Class B dam under North Carolina's dam safety regulations, meaning it held enough water to pose a significant downstream hazard if it were to fail, and any structure built in its inundation zone was subject to specific federal and state review requirements. The inundation zone, per the dam's emergency action plan on file with the State Dam Safety Program, included the drainage corridor along the eastern boundary of 14 Birchwood Lane and approximately 2/3 of the HOA Nature Preserve. The HOA had built a paved park in the floodway of a regulated dam without obtaining required permits from FEMA, the State Dam Safety Program, or the Army Corps of Engineers. While she was working through the regulatory picture, Nora was also paying attention to the neighborhood around her. She had been back for 3 weeks, and she had noticed things. Conversations over fences and at mailboxes. Small stories, offered carefully, by people who had learned to be careful. The Pattersons, 2 blocks over, had received 3 violation notices in the past year about the height of their mailbox post, each with a fine schedule attached. The Delgado family had been denied approval for a wheelchair ramp for their daughter and told they could proceed only after paying an $800 compliance review fee to have Vance Property Solutions assess the construction plan. They had paid it because fighting it would have cost more in time and energy than they had available. Luz Delgado told Nora this over the back fence with the tired matter-of-factness of someone who has made her peace with an injustice but has not forgotten it. The Moriwa family, Alex and Dana, both software engineers, who had moved in the previous spring, had received a written notice in their first 2 weeks informing them that their window treatments did not conform to community aesthetic standards. Dana mentioned it almost in passing, then stopped herself and said, "We figured we were probably just being too sensitive." Nora asked her if any of their neighbors on the street had received similar notices. Dana thought about it and said she didn't think so. James Osei, a retired professor who had lived in Lakeview Estates for 8 years, was the most direct. "You learn pretty quickly," he said, "who this place was built for. And who it wasn't." Nora had grown up in this neighborhood. She had grown up black in this neighborhood, in the house her father built with his own hands, and she carried her own memories of what it meant to be watched more carefully and welcomed less warmly than the kids 2 streets over. She had thought, coming back, that things might have changed. Looking at the pattern of who received violations and who didn't, whose projects were approved and whose were delayed, whose written complaints were answered and whose were met with silence, she understood that things had changed only in their sophistication. The mechanism was different. The effect was the same. She called her college roommate, Vanessa Park, now a senior associate at a civil rights firm in Raleigh. She laid everything out methodically. Vanessa listened without interrupting. "This is 3 separate things," Vanessa said when Nora finished. "I know. The trespass and unauthorized construction, that's your personal claim. The HOA contracting with the president's own company, that's breach of fiduciary duty and potentially fraud against the other homeowners. The pattern of disparate enforcement." "Fair Housing Act," Nora said. "Possibly. We'd need to document it carefully." A pause. "How organized are you?" "I have a spreadsheet." A short silence. "Of course you do." The documentation work took 6 weeks. Nora interviewed 14 residents. She built a comparative table of violation notices organized by household, sorted by the apparent demographic profile of the household occupants, cross-referenced with the date, the nature of the alleged violation, and whether the same violation had ever been cited against a comparable white household. The pattern was not subtle. Households she coded as non-white received violations at approximately 3 times the rate of comparable white households for identical categories of infractions. 2 households, the Moriwas and the Osais, had received notices about exterior paint colors. She identified 4 white households with paint of equivalent or greater departure from the community standards chart with no violation history. The Delgado family's wheelchair ramp situation was its own category. Under the Fair Housing Act's provisions regarding reasonable accommodations for disability, an HOA cannot impose fees on a homeowner for requesting a disability-related modification. The $800 compliance review fee charged by Vance Property Solutions, the HOA president's own company, for a wheelchair ramp application was, as Vanessa confirmed, almost certainly unlawful on 2 separate grounds. When the full picture was assembled, Nora filed 4 complaints in a single week, The trespass and unauthorized construction claim in Hargrove County Superior Court, a complaint to the State Dam Safety Program regarding unpermitted encroachment in a Class B dam inundation zone, a complaint to FEMA's regional office regarding unpermitted floodplain development, and, after a final conversation with Vanessa, a Fair Housing Act complaint with HUD's regional office in Charlotte. She also sent a letter to every homeowner in Lakeview Estates informing them, as a fellow member of the community, that the HOA was now the subject of multiple regulatory complaints and a civil lawsuit, that the HOA reserves had declined by $186,000 over 4 years, and that they had the right under the CC&Rs to inspect the financial records and to request a special meeting. 47 homeowners requested the meeting. Sandra Vance called at 7 in the evening, 12 days after the letters went out. Nora was on the back porch reviewing the Army Corps acknowledgement letter when her phone rang. Ms. Calloway. The warmth was entirely gone. What remained was harder and less practiced, which Nora found more honest. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but you are harming this entire community. The nature preserve is a beloved amenity. You are putting every one of your neighbors at legal and financial risk over a few feet of property line. 13.5 feet, Nora said. Certified survey. And sending letters to every homeowner, that is an extraordinary act of aggression against a community that has welcomed you back. My father wrote you a letter about this in June of last year, Nora said. Did you respond to him? Silence. He was 71 years old, Nora said. He wrote you a certified letter telling you that your fence was on his property and asking you to fix it. Your board didn't respond. Not once. In the 8 months between when he sent that letter and when he died, nobody from this organization acknowledged that he had written it all. The silence was different now. More textured. I'm not doing this to harm the community, Nora said. I'm doing this because the community has been harmed by its own board, and the homeowners deserve to know what was done in their names. 47 of them agreed, apparently. She paused. I'm available to discuss a full resolution that includes restoration of my property, a complete independent audit of the HOA finances, and a review of the violation history for potential fair housing issues. My attorney is Vanessa Park at Morningside Civil Rights in Raleigh. You're welcome to have Graydon Pruitt contact her. She hung up before Sandra could respond. The special homeowner meeting was held in the elementary school gymnasium 2 miles from the neighborhood. The HOA community room seated 40, and more than 100 people were coming. Nora arrived 20 minutes early, set up her laptop at the speaker's table, and arranged the one-page summary she had prepared for people who wouldn't track the full presentation. She had run enough public meetings to know that information retention drops sharply after 15 minutes, and you have to give people something to take home. She recognized most of the faces filing in. Old neighbors she hadn't seen since high school. The Delgado family, Luz holding Maria's hand. Alex and Dana Moriwa, who had driven over and found seats near the middle. James Osei, who nodded at Nora from across the room with the particular relief of watching someone say the thing you have known for years was true but calculated wasn't worth the cost of saying yourself. The Pattersons. A woman Nora didn't recognize who introduced herself as a reporter from the Hargrove County Gazette. Marcus Delaney, who had driven up from Raleigh and was sitting in the back with his arms folded. Sandra Vance arrived with Graydon Pruitt and 2 board members. They sat along the wall. Sandra held her clipboard with the posture of someone maintaining a position by sheer force of will. Nora called the meeting to order. She began with the finances, because the finances were the foundation of everything else. The 4 years of bank statements went up on screen. The chart showing reserve fund depletion. The Vance Property Solutions contracts, all 12 of them, totaling $312,000, and the Secretary of State filings identifying Sandra Vance as the company's registered agent and principal owner. The meeting minutes where each contract had been approved, and the absence, in every single set of those minutes, of the conflict of interest disclosure that the CC&Rs explicitly required. She heard sounds in the room as she went through it. Not outrage exactly. More like the sound of something clicking into place, people who had wondered why their dues kept rising while aging infrastructure went unaddressed, who had looked at the reserve fund numbers and thought something seemed off but hadn't known what to compare them to. She moved to the property dispute. The survey. The parcel map. Her father's letter, the certified mail receipt, the delivery date, and the complete absence of any response in the board records she had been provided. Someone in the room said quietly, they knew. Nora showed the FEMA floodplain map and the State Dam Safety Program inundation zone overlay. She explained in plain terms what the absence of permits meant for the drainage corridor's function and what it meant for HOA liability, and therefore for every homeowner's dues, if there were a significant rainfall event. She could feel the temperature in the room changing. Then she showed the violation records table. She didn't characterize it or editorialize. She let people read it. The households, the demographics, the violation counts, the comparable properties with no enforcement history. She waited. An older white man near the front, Patterson's neighbor, Nora thought, said, "My house has been here 14 years and I've never gotten a violation. I've let my grass go longer than the Moriwas ever have." Dana Moriwa said, carefully, "We figured we were just being too sensitive." James Osei said from the back, "You weren't." The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of full agreement, but the quiet of a large group of people simultaneously recalculating something they thought they had understood. Sandra Vance stood up. Nora acknowledged her with a nod. "I want to address this room," Sandra said, her voice controlled with visible effort, "because what is being presented tonight is a highly selective and misleading picture of 4 years of work this board has done for this community. The nature preserve has been used and appreciated by hundreds of residents. The contracts with Vance Property Solutions were appropriate and competitive. The conflict of interest disclosure policy is in the CC&Rs, Nora said, not unkindly. Section 12, Article 4. It requires a board member to disclose in writing, at the start of any meeting where a contract involving a related party is discussed, that a conflict exists. The minutes from all 12 contract approvals are available for this room to review. I have copies." She had already placed a stack near the door. Sandra held her position. "The community has benefited enormously. The reserve fund had $247,000 in it 4 years ago." Marcus said it from the back of the room, quietly, with the tone of someone stating a fact. "It has $61,000 now. The community has a Class B dam upstream and an unpermitted structure in its floodway. Those aren't selective facts. That's the situation as it exists." He paused. "I work for the State Dam Safety Program. I'm here personally tonight, but what I've reviewed is consistent with everything Ms. Calloway has presented." Sandra sat down. The motion requesting Sandra Vance's resignation from the board passed 91-14. A motion calling for an independent forensic audit of HOA finances passed 94-11. A third motion establishing an interim board and authorizing it to cooperate with all pending regulatory and legal proceedings passed unanimously. In the parking lot afterward, Luz Delgado found Nora and held her hand for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Maria gets her ramp." "Yes," Nora said. "She does." The months that followed were procedural in ways that required patience rather than drama. The County Superior Court ruled on summary judgment that the nature preserve encroached on Nora's property and ordered the structures removed within 90 days. The State Dam Safety Program issued a compliance order requiring the HOA to obtain retroactive permits or remove the encroaching hardscape from the floodway within 180 days. After consulting with Marcus, the HOA determined retroactive permitting was not feasible and began removal. FEMA opened a floodplain management review. The forensic audit identified the $312,000 in Vance Property Solutions contracts as improperly awarded, plus an additional $47,000 in personal expense reimbursements to Sandra Vance for which adequate documentation did not exist. The HOA filed civil suit against Sandra and Douglas Vance seeking recovery of the full $359,000. Douglas, who had been kept substantially in the dark about the financial mechanics, cooperated with auditors and settled separately. The HUD investigation was slow and careful, producing after 7 months a resolution agreement in which the Lakeview Estates HOA acknowledged the need for non-discriminatory enforcement practices, agreed to retain a fair housing consultant, and agreed to pay $22,500 to the Moriwa and Osei families, $14,000 to the Delgado family for the unlawful accommodation fee, and smaller amounts to 3 other households the investigation identified. Sandra Vance resigned from the board before the civil suit was filed. She and her husband put their house on the market in November. The white Lexus with the personalized plate was gone from the neighborhood by December. Nora received a court judgment in the amount of $43,800, covering the appraised encroachment value, the survey cost, the fence restoration, and her legal fees. She deposited the check and called Vanessa that evening. "I want to set something up," she said. "A fund. Small, to start. For homeowners in HOA disputes who can't afford legal representation." "There are a lot of those," Vanessa said. "I know. I'm one of them, essentially. If Marcus hadn't done the dam safety work, if you hadn't taken this on, I had professional connections most people don't have." She paused. "My father had a pen, a sheet of paper, and a certified mail slip. He tried to do things right and the board knew it could ignore him because he was elderly and alone and they'd gotten away with ignoring people before. That shouldn't be how it ends for someone." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to call it?" Nora looked out the window at the oak tree in the fading evening light. The James Calloway Fund, she said. For homeowners who did everything right and got ignored anyway. The paving came up on a Monday in October. Nora watched from the porch while the contractor's crew pulled the asphalt walkway in sections, broke up the concrete pads under the benches, loaded everything into a dumpster. By 4 in the afternoon the ground was bare and raw, the earth exposed where it had been covered for more than a year. The natural drainage line of the seasonal creek was visible again as a slight depression through the corridor, following the gradient the way water always does. It rained 2 days later. Nora went out in her boots and stood at the back of the property and watched. The water ran exactly where it was supposed to run, through the corridor, down the grade, into the lower basin, returning to the ground it had always belonged to. Drainage systems, remember. No paved path, no commemorative sign, no declaration by a homeowners association changes the underlying truth of where the water has to go. The land holds its record in soil and elevation and the quiet insistence of gravity, patient in ways that human institutions rarely are. She thought about what all of it had in common: the occupied land, the diverted contracts, the unanswered letter, the wheelchair ramp fee, the violation notices sorted by race. Not cruelty in each individual instance, though there had been cruelty in some of it. What unified it was the assumption that it would not be examined. That the people affected would not look carefully enough, or would not know what they were looking at if they did, or would not have the resources to do anything with what they found. That assumption was what made the whole system function. Remove it, and the system collapses. She thought about her father and about the certified mail slip, the return receipt stamped June 14, sitting in a folder for 8 months while he got sicker and the fence stayed up. She had the tools to fix what happened to him. Most people whose fence gets moved while they're sick don't have those tools, and that gap, between what the law provides and what an ordinary person can actually access, is where people like Sandra Vance had always operated. That was what the James Calloway Fund was for, not to make one family whole, but to close that gap, case by case, neighborhood by neighborhood, for people who had done everything right and were being failed anyway. The fund's first donation was her own $43,800. Within 3 months, Marcus had contributed and spread the word through his professional network. Vanessa added it to her firm's pro bono referral list. The Hargrove County Gazette ran a story. The first client came in the spring, a family in Durham facing a lien on their home for an unapproved mailbox, 4 months of notices, no idea that the HOA's lien authority was more limited under state law than the notices implied. Nora reviewed the situation, identified the relevant statutes, connected the family with a housing law clinic at UNC, and wrote a detailed memo that the supervising attorney called the most organized intake document she had ever received from a non-lawyer. The family kept their house. The mailbox stayed. The HOA revised its lien procedure. That was how it worked, not through a single dramatic gesture, but through documentation, through specific knowledge applied carefully, through the willingness to look closely at things that powerful people prefer you not examine. The law is slow and imperfect and requires constant pressure to function, but for the person who understands it and is willing to use it correctly, it remains the most powerful instrument available for making a wrong thing right. She had learned that from her father. Not from a lesson he gave her, but from the lesson of what had happened to him, from the certified mail slip, from the silence, from the knowledge that doing things right is necessary but not always sufficient, that the gap between the law on paper and the law in practice is real, and that closing it requires not just individual courage but collective systems, built by people who have been through the fire and come out with the specific knowledge of where it burns. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The creek ran on. The oak tree in the front yard stood exactly where her father had planted it, its roots deep in the ground of a property that was hers now, that had been his, that carried in its soil the record of everyone who had stood on it and claimed it and cared for it. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She opened her laptop. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and that was not a complaint. That was, as nearly as she could tell,